Hashem, Daf Yomi is Zevachim Daf Yodalad, Zevachim 14. We're going to start on 14a, 9 lines from the top. The daf is dedicated to Shmira for the Chayalim, Atzal for the Shvuyim, and Yeshua for Am Yisrael. The Gemara tells us that the Mishnah had stated Rabbi Shimon Machshir Behiluch. Rabbi Shimon had said the Tanna Kama of the Mishnah said that there are four essential aspects to a korban: the shchita, the slaughter, the kabbalah, the receiving of the blood, the holacha, the carrying of the blood from the basin that you collected the blood in until the mezbeach, and then the sprinkling of the blood. And if you have the wrong intent with any of those things, it's going to disqualify the korban. So, if any one of those essential qualities. But Rabbi Shimon is machshir behiluch. Rabbi Shimon said no. The wrong intent during the carrying of the blood, the halacha, does not disqualify it because the carrying of the blood was not actually essential. You'd be able to bring the korban without carrying the blood by just slaughtering it next to the mizbeach itself, and then you could skip that step. And so therefore, since you could skip that step, wrong intent during that step does not disqualify it. Amar Reish Lakish, so Reish Lakish says, Moda Rabbi Shimon balachas chatos apnimios shemachsheva poselas bo. But since you have to slaughter the korban in the courtyard of the temple, you can't slaughter it in the sanctuary, in the heichal, and the chatos panimios, the blood is applied inside the sanctuary. So you need to have a holacha, you need to have a carrying of the blood because you have to get the blood inside the sanctuary. And so therefore, Rabbi Shimon, according to Reish Lakish, would admit that if you have an improper thought by the chatos panimios, that would disqualify the korban. Because there it's an essential offering. Gemara says, is that really the case? Did Rabbi Shimon say, here's a Gemara right here, Baruch Hashem. Didn't Rabbi Shimon say, but why would we say that an improper thought, that halacha is essential by the chatos panimios, when Rabbi Shimon says we don't even care about improper thoughts at all by chatos panimios, because Rabbi Shimon says anything that's not brought on the outer altar, since the source for pigul, again, we learned about pigul yesterday, which is an improper thought as it relates to the time when the eating of the korban will take place. So there, the whole source for that is from shlomim. It's from the korban shlomim. And Rabbi Shimon said anything that is not like a shlomim, you're not liable for pigul. So therefore, there's no since the chatos panimius are not brought on the outer altar, therefore you don't even care about the improper thoughts in terms of disqualifying as it relates to that. So I'm Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina. No, yes. It doesn't apply to pigul, but it does apply to Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina says, even according to Rabbi Shimon, even though the chatos apnimios do not become pigul, nevertheless, Moda hayo, if so, he would say that they would be disqualified. They wouldn't become pigul, but they would be itself disqualified when you had a pigul thought. And he says, we learned that out from a kal v'chomer. What's the kal v'chomer? Just like if you brought the korban with the wrong intent, it's kosher by shlomim, but pasul b'chatas, but it would disqualify by a sinning offering. If you slaughter it with the wrong time in mind, by shlomim, that makes it into a pigul, and that disqualifies it. Eino din sheyivsol b'chatas. For sure, it should become disqualified by a chatas. So the Gemara says, okay, fine. Ashkan chutz l'zman. We find if you have an improper thought about the time by the chatos panimios that it's disqualified. Chutz l'mkomo mino. And if you have an improper thought about the place where it's supposed to be slaughtered, mino. And how do we know that it's also disqualified? The Gemara says, if you want to say, how can you, your thought process is to derive it from chutz l'zmano, from the beyond the proper time, you can't say that because mal chutz mizano shekin kares, because the improper thought about the time is pigul, and you get kares from it, which is the most severe penalty. But whereas chutz l'mkomo, you don't get kares, and imi shelo l'shma. And if you want to say, let's derive it from the law of shelo l'shma, which is kosher by a shlamim and puzzle by a chatos with the wrong intent, you can't say that. Why can you not say that? Shekain noeg babama, because this disqualifying thought applies by a bama with a carbon that's brought outside the base of mikdash, and so therefore it doesn't apply. The chutzlam komo doesn't apply by a bama because it's outside the place. So the Gemara says. The Gemara gives an answer. What's the source? No. By which, if you have the wrong intent, how is it disqualifying? The Pesach v'chatas. So no, the Gemara says no, because where is the disqualifying thought take place? By a Pesach and a chatas. Chatas bebama lo karbo. The sin offering was not brought by a chatas, by a bama, and also the Pesach was not brought by a bama. The by same or alternatively hekeshahu. Or else it's a hakish. It's learned out from a comparison because it says by pigul. It says by the pigul if you intend to have it consumed on the day 3, shlishi zechutz l'zmano and pigul zechutz l'mkomo. So when it says in that pasuk it's pigul, that refers to chutz l'mkomo. So we see, even if you have the thought to eat this carbon beyond the proper place, it's also going to disqualify the carbon. And by comparing it, we're learning that not only does chutz l'zmano v'chatos panimius disqualify it, but also chutz l'mkomo will also disqualify it. So now, Gemara Rava is going to bring up certain cases where the halacha is considered like an avoda that you can't nullify. Yes.
Is the difference between shalom and chatzos that shalom is
first of all, shalom is not always voluntary. Shalom is not always voluntary, but they're different. There's different laws, but the Gemara doesn't tell. The Sukkim don't always tell us why it's different, but there's difference. But that's one of the distinctions between them. But shalom is not always voluntary. For example, a carbon pesach is not voluntary. Carbon toda is not always voluntary. You're obligated to bring it. A chagiga is not voluntary. So the shalom is not necessarily voluntary. So Amar Rava, Imtim Salomar Rabbi Shimon several kabrei. So he says, okay, if you want to say Rabbi Shimon holds like his son, who says Beina Ulam V'Ulam Mizbeach. So if you're walking if you're on a Temple Mount and you're walking towards the western wall, so you're walking from Mount of Olives towards the western wall, then you're going to come to the altar, and then after the altar, you're going to come to the ulam, which is the foyer, or the antechamber to the base of Mikdash. So Rabbi Shimon holds like the position. If you want to say Rabbi Shimon holds like his son, Rabbi Lazar, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai holds like Rabbi Lazar, who says between the ulam and the mizbeach is also considered to be north. We know that the karbanos have to be slaughtered north of the altar. What if it's not directly north of the altar? What if it's northwest, between the ulam and the mizbeach? So is that going to be also considered north, and therefore you're allowed to slaughter the animal there? Well, if that's the case, ein machshava moeles balachas chatos panimios, because then according to Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon's son, the thought would not be disqualifying even by a chatos panimios. Why? Because since Ella Pesach, Ella mi Pesach ulam alefnim, except from the entrance to the ulam and inward, because you wouldn't even have to convey it there; it would be unnecessary there. So the only time where your improper thought would take place is if you're in a place where from the place where you were carrying it from the ulam to inside the base of Mikdash. But if you're carrying it towards the ulam, you don't need to be carrying it there, and so therefore it's not disqualifying at that point. V'imtim tzalomar savalak Rabbi Yehuda, and if he holds like Rabbi Yehuda, who says tochazara Mikdash, that the whole floor of the temple area is all holy, like we learned from Shlomo HaMelech, because during the Chanukah Tabayis he brought karbanos because there were so many animals on the floor of the base of Mikdash, on the floor of the courtyard. Then the only time the machshava matters when you carry the bezikin Bezikin is there was bread that was brought on the altar of there was bread that was brought on the table, and they would take the bezikin, which are these bowls that held the incense, they would take them to the mizbeach to burn them as part of the the bringing of the lechem upon him. So there, since the floor is still going to be considered holy, and so therefore it's the machshava is only going to disqualify until you come out of the ulam, because if it was inside the ulam, it can't be. Then we're going to say it's essential, but the walking within the sanctuary itself is not going to be disqualifying, because the shulchan could be really anywhere in the Beis Hamikdash. And also, once you bring it out of the ulam, it also wouldn't be disqualifying, because there it's all holy, and the mizbeach could be there, or you could bring it on the floor there, even though the mizbeach is not there. So the only part it would be disqualifying would be the only part would be disqualifying, because it would be essential would between the sanctuary entrance and between during the ulam itself. That's the only place. So it's from the sanctuary and outward during the ulam. And if you be of the position that the sanctuary's holiness and the lobby, the foyer's holiness are the same, so it would only, with the thought that would be disqualifying would only be from the entrance into the ulam and outside of that. But while you're still in the ulam, that would also not be essential, because you could have brought it right there. You could have had the shulchan right there. And if you want to say the entranceway into the ulam is like the ulam itself, then the only time it would help, then the only time there would be halacha that could be disqualifying a thought would be during the part where you stretch out your hand to take it from the courtyard into the ulam itself, because otherwise everything else, it was not necessary actually to carry it. And if you be in the position that conveying something without carrying it is not called conveying, so according to that, there is no need to actually carry it, because you could have done it without carrying it, and so therefore it would not be a disqualifying thought. Gemara says, Amoy Abaye Amore de Rav Chisda. So Abaye said to the Amore of Rav Chisda. By the way, what's an Amore of Rav Chisda? Do you know what that is? So, okay, so in those days, they didn't have microphones like we have today, and they would have hundreds, if not thousands, of people coming to listen. And the rabbi was very skilled, but the teacher was very skilled, but he didn't necessarily have the loudest voice, and he wasn't a trained microphone. So they had people who were professional microphones, whose job it was to speak in a very loud voice, and they would get the word out. So that's why I would say that. So Abaye said to the Amore of Rav Chisda, they knew how to be heard, probably even just as well as we can do it with our microphones, but they had professional. That's why, by the way, this is the source of the idea. Amoraim were the ones who said things over. Let's say a non-Kohen carries the blood. Is that going to be disqualifying? Amalei Kshera. So Rav Chisda says the Chiddush, it's kosher. He says with Mikra Misayeni, I have a pasuk to support me. Vayishchatu as a Pesach, vayizriku hakohanim as Adam. It says in Divrei Hayam, and we just read this as part of our everyday daily study of Tanakh. We're coming to the conclusion of it, and we just read this pasuk. They slaughtered the Pesach, and the Kohanim sprinkled the blood miyadam v'alavim mavshitim. They slaughtered the Pesach, the Kohanim took the blood from their hands, and the Levium skinned it. We see from here that the Yisraelim were the ones carrying it, so the Levium took it from them and skinned it. Yeah, question? No, but sure, of course. So the Gemara says, so that proves that you don't need a Kohen to carry it. Matzah Rav Sheshes. So Rav Sheshes says, but we have a question from this, because we learned in the Brayta, Zar va'onin, a zar, a non-Kohen, and an onin, and also an onin is Rahman also on something on the day of the death of one of the 7 relatives, and also shikor, a Kohen who's drunk, ubalmum, a Kohen who has a blemish, b'kaboa b'olacha b'zrika apostle. That if any of these people do any of these 3 activities, the receiving of the blood, the conveying of the blood, and the sprinkling, but it's disqualified. We see from here that Zara does the conveying of the blood is disqualifying. V'chein Yoshev v'chein small. Also a Kohen who's sitting, or also a Kohen who does it with his left hand. Disqualified. What if he is a lefty? Doesn't matter. By the way, they had no trust of lefties. Anybody here a lefty? Okay, they didn't trust lefties. They thought they were dangerous. They thought they were sinister. You know that? The word for left-handed in Latin is sinister. They had no trust of the lefties because they
That's carried through to early in the 20th century. People forced methodology, forced to just
become ambidextrous. Well, it is probably more convenient to be a righty because most of the world is biased towards righties. So, like the driving and everything is designed for righties. But they didn't trust the lefties. They thought they were sneaky. We have a story like that in the Tanakh where Ehud hid his sword on the side because he was a lefty. He hid it on the sword that they weren't expecting to find it. And that's why the warriors who were lefties were better warriors because they drew their sword opposite from everybody else. Nobody caught on to that. So anyway, we see that this is a tiyufta. Gemara says, "Well, Rav Chisda Kraka Amar." Rav Chisda has a pasuk that where they said in Divrei Yamim they just carried the blood that they took the blood from the Israelim and not from the Kohanim. Gemara says no. To Avin Ma'ase Itztaba. No, they were stationary. They were like a bench. They took it from them, but the Israelim were not. They were holding it, but they weren't carrying it. Rabbi Rav Yosef Damar Travay Olacha Bazar Machokas Rabbi Shimon Rabbanan. Rabbi Rav Yosef say that conveying it while you're a non-Kohen is a dispute between Rabbi Shimon and the Rabbanan. Rabbi Shimon the Amar Avodah she'efshar levatra lav avodahi. Rabbi Shimon said it can be done by a non-Kohen. Why? Because he says since you don't need to do the halacha, since it's not essential. Why is it not essential? Because you could do it right next to the mizbeach. Therefore, it's not part of the service, and so therefore it's kshera bazar. Therefore, it's kosher. Whereas the Rabbanon, so according to Rabbanon, it's disqualified. So Rabbi Rav Yosef say it's a machokas to Rabbi Shimon and the Rabbanon. But we have a problem with your theory because slaughtering the animal, that's something that you need. It's essential. But that's also not, but a Kohen's not required for that. So a non-Kohen could do it. Amarlei says, no, Shlita lav avodai. Shlita, the slaughtering of the animal, ironically, he says, is not a service. It's not one of the services. Yeah, we say it's one of the four, but it's not considered an avoda because even a non-Kohen could do it. So it's a whole question, which we'll discuss when we get to it. We'll further discussion, but that's the statement that the shchita is not, what does that mean exactly? But shchita is lav avoda. Shchita is not considered an avoda. Because the Torah never says the shchita has to be done specifically by a Kohen. Another reason why maybe it's not considered an avoda is the Rimi Orleans, who says that the shchita is the same act by kodshim, by sacred, and by chulin, so therefore it's not an avoda. Gemara says, "V'lo is it not an avoda?" V'amar Rabbi Zer Amar Rav shchita's para bazar psua. If you slaughter the red heifer by a non-Kohen, it's disqualified. V'amar Rav Allah Elazar v'chulka ksiva. And Rav said about that. What's the reason? Because it says Elazar and the Elazar Kohen was commanded on it because it says Zos chukasa b'Torah. Chukah means that whatever is said by the para is essential. And so we see from here that it needs to be done by a Kohen. So also Shlita. Gemara says, no, Shanik para dekachi bedek habayisi. The para aduma doesn't have inherent kedusha, it just has value. And the para aduma is ironically not a korban. So therefore, it has to be done by a Kohen. So isn't that a for sure? If you say when it's just monetary value, it needs to be done by a Kohen, like the paraduma, kachim is bech, an actual korban, lav avodi. When you say for sure it needs to be done by a Kohen and it's a service, so Rav Sheshes Breder Avidi, midi dahava amaros negayim. The lav avodi ubai kahuna. He says no. Even though it's not, the reason why you need a Kohen is not because it's considered an avoda, because it's similar to mitzora, to seeing the tsaras, which is not an avoda, looking at the tsaras, but still, nevertheless, it requires the kahuna. Gemara says, "Varei olacha seivarim lekevesh davodah she'efshar levatalahi upsula bizarre." But what about the carrying of the limbs to the altar, which is not essential because you could do it right on the altar and not have to carry it, and it's disqualified by a non-Kohen. The kriva Kohen has to call the tira mizbecha. That a Kohen has to do it. So the Gemara says, "Eicha the gali." Where the Torah says specifically you need a Kohen, you need a Kohen. Eicha the lo gali, lo gali. But where it doesn't tell us, you don't need it. And it doesn't tell it to us by a shchita. Gemara says, "Well, I've called the Chaynu. Isn't it for sure? Just like the carrying of the limbs to the altar. The lo ma'akva kapara, which is not essential by kahuna and it requires a kohen. Hoechas dam de ma'akva kapara, the conveying of the blood, which is in fact essential for the atonement. Will call shekain for sure to require a kohen. Gemara says kasha. Okay, we have that. That's a question. Itmar nami. Indeed, we learned Amrullah Rabbi Elazar halacha b'zar psula fil Rabbi Shimon. Even according to Rabbi Shimon, who says you don't need to do halacha. And then the improper thought doesn't disqualify it, but if it would be done by a non-Kohen, it will be disqualified. Now the Gemara asks the next question. Let's say you don't carry it with your foot, you just stretch out your hand. Is that called conveying it? Does it need to be done by a Kohen or even by not? Yeah. You have very long hands. You're Shaquille O'Neal and your hands are like 2 feet long. So basically, you can cover the distance. Tashma small. Don't we say that if you're sitting while you do the service or with your left hand, it's disqualifying? But if the Kohen is standing but he's not moving, it's kosher. And so we see from here only by sitting does the Torah disqualify. But when he does it standing, even though he doesn't carry it with his foot, he just sticks out his hand. It's kosher. And so we see from here, halacha doesn't need to be done by moving. And so therefore, a non-Kohen can't do it. Gemara says, no, maybe not. Dilma Yoshev Dekashya Meshev. Maybe it's somebody who's sitting and basically dragging himself to the altar. That's what's disqualifying. Because he's conveying himself by like scooting along. But Ome Dumya Yoshev, but if he's standing and it's similar to sitting, then it will be, that's denied porta because he moves a little bit with his legs. And it's not exactly the same. So how do we answer the question? Tashma shacha Yisrael v'kibo kohen. Let's say the Jew slaughtered it and the Kohen received it. Nisanu chaver, and they passed it along. That's how they did the Paschal lamb. That was the initial conveyor belt. Was they just kept passing it along to have efficiency. One Jew slaughtered it, and the Kohen just kept passing and passing, but they didn't move. So we see from here, halacha, you don't need to move. Gemara says, no, deny deportation. They probably moved a little bit. So if that's the case, why is it telling us how they did it? Why do we need to know how they did the Paschal lamb? If they moved a little, what's the chiddush there that they passed it along? No, it's telling us the chiddush that when the Paschal lamb did it, they had everybody involved. Because the more people are involved, the greater glory for the king. So they had a whole conveyor belt. Well before the anti-Semites set it up at Ford, the conveyor belt, we had the initial conveyor belt. We slaughtered it and we passed it along from coin to coin. Tashma kibel akosher, if the coin who was kosher received the blood and not some apostle, give it to somebody disqualified, then yachzio kosher. You have to take it back from the disqualified coin and give it to the kosher. And we see from here that even though the dam was in the hands of the blood was in the hands of somebody who was not kosher, it doesn't disqualify it. And even though he wasn't moving, it's not considered halacha. So doesn't that prove it? No, no, maybe you should give it back to the Kohen who didn't move, and he should, and he will. He doesn't need to go back and convey the blood because maybe we're going to say that is considered, meaning to say maybe you should read Yachzor HaKosher V'Yikabel, that the Kohen who's standing there next to the altar should take the blood from the disqualified, and then he should continue to walk to the altar, and he doesn't need to go back and to convey the blood because when he stuck out the hand initially, that was considered halacha. So it's not a proof. Okay, we'll stop here. Baruch Hashem, we'll pick it up again tonight. Shekayach.